Okay. Hey, good morning, everybody. We're delighted to see you this morning. My name is Thomas Mackey, and I'm in the history department at the University of Louisville, as well as with the law school here at the University of Louisville.
Good morning. I'm Dan Taubman. I'm a senior judge on the Colorado Court of Appeals in Denver, Colorado. Congratulations on making it to the top 12. We're looking forward to your presentation this morning.
Good morning and congratulations. My name is Lindsay Draper. I am retired from the juvenile court bench here in Milwaukee County, Wisconsin. And as some of you may know, my son graduated from Wauwatosa West.
Please introduce yourselves.
Well, good morning. We are Unit 2 from Wauwatosa West High School as the state champions from Wisconsin. I am Nora Rommelfanger.
I am Rachel Lavelle. I'm Mackenzie Jacoby.
And I'm Nora Ingring.
And we are here on behalf of our mentors, teachers' assistants, and teacher, Mr. Chad Mateski.
All right, cool. The question we've chosen, oh, good. Now I cough, sorry. The question we've chosen is question number 1 out of Unit 2. It reads as follows. What were the major disagreements among the 55 delegates during the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, and how were they resolved? What issues, if any, were not resolved, and what were the consequences? What changes, if any, should be made to the Constitution? You may begin.
At the Annapolis Convention, a draft of the report made to the states declared, "Render the situation of the United States delicate and critical, calling for an exertion of the united virtue and wisdom of all members of the Confederacy." The Annapolis Convention served as one catalyst for the Philadelphia Convention after the Articles of Confederation proved to be unsustainable as issues such as Shays' Rebellion arose regarding the economy, a lack of central government, and a near impossible amendment process.
Although the Philadelphia Convention's original purpose was to revise the Articles, this was soon unrealistic. An initial conflict the delegates faced was that they would need states to compromise interests to form an effective central government. With this in mind, the proposed Virginia Plan divided power between the states and 3 branches of a national government. After coming out of British tyranny, the delegates were especially wary of an executive branch. Because of this, they decided on a system of checks and balances in hopes that no one branch would overpower another.
This plan also exposed disagreements on representation, producing a major debate over bicameral legislature and representation within Congress. The Great Compromise settled this, giving the Senate equal representation, appeasing the small states, while the House of Representatives would be proportional to population, benefiting the large states. This decision ignited further division amongst the northern and southern states, eventually producing Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3, known as the 3/5 Clause. This gave slave states more representation in the House than they otherwise would have had, while also being taxed more.
Attempts to avoid further controversy, the delegates bypassed pressing moral issues of slavery. Since to many, slavery was a necessary evil needed to hold the Union together, the delegates delayed further action until 1808, leading to the Civil War, the 13th Amendment, and modern-day systemic racism. Philosophical issues of the extent of state power also remained unresolved. Founders were unable to foresee significant events to come, so they created a malleable document, or they allowed for federalism to follow a pendulum of jurisdictional control between the states and federal government, which can be seen when comparing the presidencies of FDR to Ronald Reagan.
A majority of the Constitution focused on the common good, but failed to include protections for many natural rights. Many Federalists argued to include a Bill of Rights gave implied powers not delegated in the Constitution. However, the promise of a Bill of Rights was later essential for ratification. Among these additions was the 7th Amendment, which defined some judicial powers intentionally left vague. One shortcoming was that there were no ways to mandate jury trials in civil cases, jeopardizing individual rights and proving costly in time and money.
Amendments to the Constitution are crucial to maintaining the timelessness the founders intended. While it is important the Constitution cannot be changed easily, it is almost impossible to pass amendments. We suggest a 2/3 rather than a 3/4 majority to pass amendments in state legislatures and state conventions. Another revision we advocate for is the removal of the punishment clause from the 13th Amendment, as states are permitted to pay felons extremely low rates for labor.
Due to the disproportionate effects of mass incarceration on the Black and Hispanic communities, this clause feeds into the racial injustice left untouched by the delegates. The disenfranchisement of felons is a major controversy on modern day debates on representation. Similar worries have come to light regarding the first past the post approach to the Electoral College. To create unity, we suggest a legislative act to establish a proportional distribution system among the votes of the states.
While debating numerous controversial topics, many delegates were forced to give up some of their ideas for others. This marketplace of ideas allowed for many compromises. However, as Thomas Jefferson acknowledged in the preamble of the Declaration of Independence, not everything can be addressed in a single document. Because of this concept, the delegates left room for future debate and improvement we see within the Constitution today. Thank you. This concludes our statement, and we are now ready for your follow-up questions.
Oh, many thanks. Lots to bite down on there. Do my colleagues want to jump in? Judge, or shall I go on?
Well, why don't you start and then I'll follow after you.
Perfectly fine. I didn't want to just jump the queue there. Look, this is that evergreen area in American constitutional history. This is one of these key turning points. And I think that there's a great deal that can be sort of talked about there. One of these issues is representation by population and representation by geographic area. Representing the states has become at least debatable, or at least on the table. Should states continue to be represented as entities unto themselves in the United States Senate?
Under Article 5 of the US Constitution, it states that no state will be denied a seat in the Senate without its knowing consent. It is highly unlikely that any state will consent to this. So even if we think that it is necessary for us not to have the Senate the way it is currently, it is unconstitutional.
Additionally, we can see within James Madison's Virginia plan that his entire purpose behind the Senate was to have equal representation to all states. And this would serve as a cooling saucer so that each state or the Senate would serve as almost a check on the House of Representatives to elongate their system of checks and balances that they have.
Geographical representation is still needed today because there are numerous clauses and processes within the Constitution where the states are needed, such as the election of senators or the election of the House of Representatives.
I would even go beyond this and say that we need to remove the 17th Amendment in order to bring the focus of the Senate back into the states. By giving the people the power to vote, it kind of takes the interests away from the states themselves and moves them more into the political parties and the people within them.
Interesting. The amendment process is clumsy at times and long, like it's supposed to be. And yet you still read, and certainly the scholarship says, that in time, the United States Supreme Court acts in some ways as an ongoing constitutional convention. How do you think about that? Do you think that's a valid way to think about one aspect of what the Supreme Court does, or is that just complete hooey that I made up on an early Monday morning?
Well, we can see how the court's rulings are seen as almost quasi amendments to this day. And I believe that that's a power that the founders may not have necessarily anticipated with the growth of the federal judiciary power, as they saw this as the weakest branch and therefore included much fewer checks and balances on the judicial branch when delegating their powers.
The founders left many of the judicial powers intentionally vague because they knew that the first federal Congress would have to manipulate and rework how that works. So the judiciary is somewhat of a new constitutional convention, as the founders intentionally left it so that more of a skeleton of a body.
I'd like to go back to the Constitutional Convention and ask you, what debates were there among the founders regarding the presidency or the executive branch?
Alexander Hamilton's proposed New York plan would have established a monarchical government. This was strongly rejected, however, because the colonists and therefore delegates had just faced a tyrannical government under Great Britain, so they rejected this plan due to fear that it would become similar to the government they had just run from.
One argument was the number of executives, as they had come out of a British tyranny where there was a single executive who was very tyrannical, but under the Articles, there was no executive branch. So the number of executives was very argued.
The extent of the executive power was an extremely controversial topic at the time of the convention, and they actually started out early in the convention discussing what this could be, and these arguments went all the way until the end of the convention, as it was one of the last things being discussed. And we can see that this was possible to the Pinnett rule, which allowed the delegates to sort of create the executive branch in particular as more of a puzzle piece.
Additionally, the pardon power was argued at the convention, as the delegates were wary of giving the executive a pardon, as they could pardon possibly loyalists who they may not have appreciated.
So I want to go back and talk a bit about the deferral of the discussion of slavery. And specifically, what I want you to talk to me about is my belief that the founders opted for money over morals. That as opposed to people who were firm enough to say slavery is a stain on our country, but the Southern economy requires that they use these guys, and we don't want to run the risk of not having them as part of our nation. So even if we're abolitionists, we're not going to go along with that. We want to talk about this later. Very aspirational language didn't mean a darn thing when it came to money. What do you say?
I say yes, while there were many slave owners and they were the elite of the population, they created Article 5, the Amendment Clause, in order to go along with the times, because they understood that slavery would probably die throughout the time of the American Constitution was in place. So with this fifth article, we could create the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which would specifically the 13th Amendment prohibit slavery from existing.
As Benjamin Franklin stated in his Poor Richard's Almanac book, necessity never made a good bargain. So the colonists, they had just come out of a tyrannical government. They were $75 million in debt, which translates to 900 billion in today's dollars. So they had no means of funding another or a civil war.
I disagree with this because at the time of the founding, the cotton gin had not been invented, and the cotton gin was what pushed slavery into a much bigger, unfortunately, the big deal that it was in the US today, or the effects that it has today. So they did not see this coming. So therefore, it was not an economic move.
I would argue that although slavery is morally inexcusable and the delegates should have known better at the time of the founding, the United States was also in an extremely weak position coming out of the Revolutionary War. They were millions of dollars in debt, and the founders were aware that if they didn't come up with a strong government and fast, that Britain could easily take over their government again, and the United States and all of that work with the Revolutionary War would be rendered useless.
So I interpret what you're telling me as our, meaning the founders' freedom from Britain, is more important than this group of people that we've decided are property. Is that what I'm hearing?
Slavery is never a correct moral, although at the social times, it was an accepted value.
They created the slave trade clause because they understood that slavery would not be an institution that would last very long, and they thought that it would die throughout time. So they created this so that it couldn't be an institution that did prevail.
However, as my panel member Nora had mentioned before, leaving this slavery as not an inherently anti-slavery document opened the door for the cotton gin to be invented and much the slavery to grow as an industry, as they were providing over 3/4 of the world's cotton by the 1800s.
I would like to.
Well, go ahead.
I would like to disagree with my panel members. I align myself with William Lloyd Brixton, who said that the inclusion of slavery in the Constitution was a convent with death and agreement with hell. It is never acceptable to have accepted this into the document, even for economic gain.
The very first day that slavery was allowed constitutionally to be amended and abolished, there was legislation that was passed through to have it abolished.
Yeah, interesting. One of these evergreen big questions there. What is the relationship of the so-called Second American Constitution, the 14th Amendment, with the 1787 ratified in 1788 constitutional document? Is there a relationship very quickly between the 14th and the Constitution? Or is the Constitution a second American, the 14th Amendment, a second American Constitution? Go ahead, Ms. Rubblefinger.
I would argue that these Reconstruction amendments were an extension of what the Constitution should have been initially. And it was, although it was delayed, they were necessary in moving our country forward, not only socially, but also morally. And it was overdue, but we got there eventually.
Okay. Wish we had another half hour. Wish we had another half hour. Unfortunately, we don't. Look, these are some of these hard questions that legislators, Congresses, Supreme Court justices, political leaders have been struggling with for, well, since the 18th century. So of course we ask high school students to solve them for us. It's in that sense, we're looking to see how you think about these issues. I thought you did a really nice job on the executive question, on my question, and I think on this tough question of, does historical context help us understand the positions taken on slavery, or are there other ways to go about thinking about this? So I also like the fact of how you traded off. You guys worked as a team. Well done, folks. I mean, really well done.
Thank you.
I agree that your presentation was well done. I appreciate your discussion of the disputes about representation and whether and the Great Compromise, and how the issue of slavery was bypassed. And in answering the questions, and you're talking about whether the issue of money predominated over morals. You talked about the slave trade clause, but there are two other provisions of slavery. One was the 3/5 clause that you mentioned earlier, and the other was the fugitive slave clause that you might have mentioned in your opening statement. You had some interesting proposals for how the Constitution was amended. Changing the amendment process itself from 3/4 to 2/3 was interesting. I'm not sure if that would actually be likely to make a practical difference. I wish we had had more time. I would have liked you to have asked you about your views about the Equal Rights Amendment and other proposed amendments. I would quibble with you a little bit about your statement that Alexander Hamilton favored a monarchical government. In Ron Chernow's biography of Alexander Hamilton, he refuted that notion that some people had said that Hamilton favored a monarchical government. He favored a strong executive, but not necessarily a monarchical government. That's what Jefferson and some of his opponents accused him of. So, but that's a relatively minor point. I think you showed a really good understanding of all aspects of the question, and congratulations again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So there's a certain danger in seeing a judge who's heard what you've got to say before, and who I guess in a way had time to, oh, what can I say this time when I talk to him? And I really enjoyed your presentation. I have to compliment you on your taking on the question that I asked you about slavery. I mean, that I have a number of areas that I maybe would tender to you as disagreements with your responses, but what I thought were you made very well-reasoned and well-supported responses. And I think it's that latter part that is the critical piece, not that you say what I'm going to agree with, but that you have a basis for what it is that you say. So you are to be rightly proud of not only making it to the top 12, but also your performance today. So good luck to you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you
Good
for your
stuff, folks.
time.
Thank
All
you.
right. At this time, I'm going to open the judges' room. We'll allow them to scoot on out. Congratulations. Y'all did a
Okay.
fantastic job.
Start breathing.
Thank you.